one of the things that was new with ESSA 2 years ago was that the guidance gave a little bit more information for how to help figure out when a living situation would be considered so substandard that it would meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. So they instruct to check utilities, infestations, mold, dangerous situations. So if you look at the 2017 guidance A3, there's just a little bit more information. And again, it's always case by case, but still that guidance can be helpful. We also know from a study that was done 2 years ago that the majority of McKinney-Vento students are going to be in a very fluid situation. We often talk about homeless families and unaccompanied youth as if they're two siloed populations, but the reality is many youth and children will experience homelessness in both with their family and also by themselves. So we know from the study that was done 2 years ago, 47%, almost half of youth who were interviewed who'd been homeless said they were homeless in both situations. They've been homeless repeatedly. The vast majority stay with other people other than a place that they called home, and still over half were in some of these very open or very explicit forms of homelessness. So, you know, we know that you're all aware of that, but we want you to have that as you do trainings for school personnel. Unaccompanied homeless youth also has a definition in the law: a child or youth who both meets the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness and is not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So we'll spend some time talking about unaccompanied youth. When we say unaccompanied youth, we're talking about a youth who meets both parts, homeless and also not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. The reasons, you know, a lot of time when we're doing training, and you may find this too, that it's sort of, people are very puzzled because they think, well, these are kids who should be in foster care, and frankly, many of them should be, but there's lots of reasons why they're not. A lot of them have very similar life experiences. They're homeless because of abuse or neglect. You can see the statistics there that come from the runaway hotline that the government administers about why youth were running away from home, why they were there. So abuse, neglect, and also parental substance abuse and mental health issues. Also, we know that there's conflicts, severe conflicts in the home, sexual orientation, gender identity, pregnancy, all contribute to youth homelessness, and just the situations of family homelessness. So being homeless with the family and there's no space, so the youth ends up by themselves. And again, just to reiterate that there's a lot of fluidity between family and youth homelessness. In terms of our scale, our numbers, we know for 15-16, nationally it was 1.3 million, which was an increase over the past 4 years. The 16-17 data for the nation will be out at the end of the month. There's a lag time with the department. And while it's not public yet, I can tell you that it'll go up again. For our youth who are older and our young adults, the research that we have from Chapin Hall, which we cite a lot in this presentation, and there's a link at the bottom there. They actually did a different sort of study, a national prevalence study, which is more accurate than school identified. It's also way more accurate than the HUD PIT counts. And they showed that between the ages of 14 and 24, youth on their own, over 4 million. And really important, I think, particularly for states like Nebraska that have a lot of rural areas, is that the prevalence of youth homelessness was the same statistically in rural, suburban, and urban areas. It's just very hidden. So it's something we sort of already know, but now we've got good research to show that it's the same in terms of how many youth experience homelessness, just much more invisible. And then going to our younger children who are experiencing homelessness, this number here comes from the Department of Health and Human Services, looking at children who are under age 6, and their estimate is over 1.2 million children under age 6 nationally would have experienced homelessness. Other research shows that infancy is actually the time in a person's life where they're most at risk of entering a homeless shelter. So we don't have, we touch on the preschool piece here in our presentation, but we know that early Head Start childcare are key partners because graduation doesn't start in high school. Graduation starts at the beginning of life. It starts with early childhood. So we really want to emphasize that point as part of our getting kids to graduation. Identification is the first step. And again, this is by way of review. So I'm sure a lot of you know this, but the study that we cited a couple of slides ago, the Hidden in Plain Sight study, 67% of youth and young adults said they weren't comfortable talking about their homelessness or asking for help. So that really then becomes about how schools can be proactive with sensitivity to identify these young people, these children and youth, because we know that if we don't identify them, then they don't get any of the benefits of school, which can change the trajectory of their lives. So you have a link in the corner there again, which is a link to a resource that Patricia has. It was a session that she did with young people at several conferences where young people gave their insights about how they felt in terms of talking to school personnel. And I don't know, Patricia, were we going to try to play that or just sort of offer it as a resource?
I think just a resource. I'm not sure how the audio will work on Zoom.
Okay, so we won't tempt the fate of the interwebs by trying to play the audio file, but just know when you have that PowerPoint that that's a resource for you. So just questions to ask yourself, and we know identification is challenging, and that there are many tricks of the trade, but to really be asking, what are we doing? Who's been trained? Who are the eyes and the ears within the school district? Everyone from front desk to teachers to bus drivers to cafeteria workers to coaches. So who can we enlist in the identification of children and youth? How are we representing McKinney-Vento information on school district web pages, for example? That can be, even families who are experiencing homelessness may have access to the internet and may be looking there for information. Also, families who are not homeless yet but at risk also get information that way as well. Who in the community helps us? Who are our community partners to help us proactively find children and youth who are McKinney-Vento and let them know about their right to go to school? And then this being very intentional about young children when we are trying to reach out and make sure that the siblings of our school-age children are a part of our identification efforts. So again, looking in more detail at this question. Some of the tips, and I'm sure these are things that you all are doing too, but we have this word homeless. It's in the federal law. It's part of the federal program, so it's there. But it can be a barrier in and of itself because of the stigma that goes along with that, and because of the fear that parents have that their kids will be taken away from them, the shame that they're not providing for them, and of course the fear for adolescents about triggering child welfare or some other sort of unwelcome authority, as well as just being ashamed of their situation. So some of the tricks of the trade that districts across the country use when they're trying to do McKinney-Vento identification, but avoid that stigma, asking families where would you, and particularly in the situations that are doubled up situations, where would you go if you couldn't stay here? If a family, or what led you to move into this situation? So families that don't have other options, in answering those questions can help get to both their McKinney-Vento eligibility in a way that doesn't attach a label to their situation. And we know, of course, that training is the number one best way. It needs to be often and comprehensive. There's high turnover among school staff, so whoever got trained last year may be in a different role, always somebody new coming in. So again, as I mentioned, anybody who is working in a school district who's working with young people, working with families, really does need to know about the McKinney-Vento Act and who meets the definition and who liaisons are. Also, we know that getting information out, and there's requirements in McKinney-Vento to do this when we get into the liaison duties. We'll talk about that. So the websites, school buildings, motels, it's going to look different in every community where you would disseminate notice. Being intentional, I guess, about our teens and young adults in terms of those organizations, the questions that can be asked on enrollment forms about housing status, and then again, just reiterating the school sibling piece. And I think with that, I now turn it over to Patricia to get a little bit more of the McKinney-Vento kind of 101 nuts and bolts.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. We are going to spend most of our time talking about graduation strategies, but really there's so much in McKinney-Vento that they are graduation strategies in and of themselves. For example, if we're not identifying our students, we can't be supporting them. And issues like school stability and immediate enrollment obviously have a huge impact on graduation. So just quickly, some of the educational impacts of homelessness, you all know this, you work with McKinney-Vento students every day. There is an 87% correlation between homelessness and dropping out of school. So it was the highest risk factor of all the factors that were examined in that particular study, which came out probably about 5 years ago now. And we know that this effect can be cumulative over time. So intervening as early as we can, doing identification as young as we can so that we can provide interventions early actually is a very important graduation strategy. We also know that lacking a high school diploma or GED has been found by research to be the #1 risk factor for young adult homelessness. So again, if we're not working to help make sure that our students can graduate from high school, then we're really creating a situation where they're much more likely to experience homelessness again as young adults. Perhaps with their children, their family will be homeless, and then we'll be starting again with a new generation. So graduation from high school is extremely important when we're talking about our McKinney-Vento students to help them get out of the situation they're in. And most of our students know that. They know how important education is. So just quickly, school stability is a really important graduation strategy. We know that when students change schools, they're more likely to drop out of school, particularly at the secondary level. So we do have provisions about school stability in McKinney-Vento, and students do have the right to stay in the school of origin. So just quickly, what is the school of origin? That's an important question. We do have a definition very clearly in the law. It's the school attended when the student was permanently housed, or the school in which the student was last enrolled, and it does include a preschool. And again, early intervention and preschool services really are a very important graduation strategy if we look at the long-term goals. So getting young children into preschool and allowing them to stay in preschool are really important issues. So we won't spend a lot of time on this today, but if you're wondering what preschool means under McKinney-Vento, there are so many early childhood programs. And a lot of times the question comes up, well, is this Head Start a preschool, or is this daycare center a preschool? So you have on your slide there the definition that the U.S. Department of Ed uses when it determines preschool. So again, we won't go into this in detail, but we want to make sure you have the information with you. Another piece of the definition of school of origin is that it does include a designated receiving school if you have feeder school patterns in your district. Some districts do have this, some districts don't. So this may or may not apply to you. But if your district has a feeder school pattern where all the children from McKinney Elementary move on to Vento Middle, everyone knows that's going to happen, it's expected, all the peers know they're all going to go together to the same middle school, then that middle school actually would be part of the school of origin definition for that student. On the other hand, if that's just not how your school district works, and once kids finish McKinney-Vento, McKinney Elementary School, they might go to all different middle schools depending on where they live or what they're associated with, or you might have an open choice system, then you don't have a feeder school pattern, and so this wouldn't apply to you. In terms of what McKinney-Vento says about the rights for school of origin, every local educational agency shall keep the children in their school of origin if that is in their best interest. We do have something in the law now that says that we're going to assume that keeping children in their school of origin is in their best interest. So that's where we're going to err on that side. We're going to really try to keep them stable for as long as they're homeless and until the end of the academic year in which they become permanently housed. So they get to stay in the school of origin as kind of their touchstone and their stability. When we're determining best interest, like I said, we're going to presume that keeping the student in their school of origin is in their best interest, unless the parent or guardian or the unaccompanied youth doesn't want that. Oftentimes families want to move because of issues that might be related to domestic violence or to having a fresh start at a new school. And the school district also will look into other student-specific factors like safety, the actual benefit to the education of the student. Distance may become a factor. It's not so much how long the commute is, but whether that commute is actually negatively impacting the student's education. So you can look at different factors and always give priority to the request of the parent or guardian. That doesn't mean we always do whatever the parent or guardian wants, but we do give priority to their request. And this is new in ESSA when McKinney-Vento was amended back in December of 2015. It now says give priority to the request of an unaccompanied youth. It used to say consider the youth's wishes, and that was changed to give priority to the request of an unaccompanied youth. I think that's important because sometimes an unaccompanied youth might have an idea about where they want to go to school. You're working with the youth on that. You get them placed, you get them settled, everything's going kind of fine. And then you might get a call from a parent It says, I don't want my student in that school, I want them in this other school. And so as a school district, what do you do if you feel caught between a rock and a hard place of the parents' wishes and the unaccompanied youth wishes? And McKinney-Vento very clearly states to give priority to the unaccompanied youth. Everyone knows, I think, about transportation to the school of origin. That is a requirement. So as long as the student is going to be in the school of origin because it is in their best interests, then the school district would have to provide that transportation to the school of origin and work in collaboration with the school wherever the student's living, since the student may be crossing district lines, may even be crossing state lines, depending on what the situation is. So that's school stability. Again, like we said, we're going through this part really quickly, but we want to move right on to immediate enrollment. This is really kind of what McKinney-Vento was originally passed to do way back in 1987, was to make sure that children could enroll in school even if they didn't have that lease agreement or that utility bill or that piece of paper that gave them proof of residency, since we know that students experiencing homelessness don't have that. And unfortunately, 30 years later, when we talk to students, we find that 62% of them report that proof of residency is still a challenge when they're enrolling in a new school, and that really shouldn't be the case. So we're going to really quickly go over the immediate enrollment rules just to make sure that we're all familiar with them and remembering them and able to implement them. So what McKinney-Vento says is that our McKinney-Vento students are entitled to immediate enrollment in any public school that students living where they're living would be eligible to attend. So they're going to have a neighborhood school, obviously, depending on where they're sleeping, and then there may or may not be other educational options in that district, depending on what your district offers. But our students would be able to enroll in those schools immediately, regardless of the typical paperwork requirements. So you look, my mom was a school secretary, she had her enrollment checklist, and that checklist basically goes out the window when you're enrolling a McKinney-Vento student. They get enrolled immediately, even if they don't have immunization, school records, guardianship, proof of residency, any of those documents that are typically required. They also get to enroll immediately even if they've missed application or enrollment deadlines. This usually comes into play with things like preschool or perhaps some specialized programs that you may have that actually fill up. They don't have capacity for everyone. So if there's an application deadline, let's say in the spring, to get children into preschool in the fall, if there's space in that classroom when your McKinney-Vento student comes into your district, whether that's in September or May, we want to get them into that program right away, even though they missed the application deadline. Enroll is defined as attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So again, we're not just talking about getting students on our rosters, but making sure that they're actually fully participating. And then while they're in school and participating fully, then we can go back to that checklist and then we can start thinking, okay, do we have immunizations? If not, let's get them connected to a healthcare provider who can provide them with those. Let's contact the previous school and get the school records and work on those policies. And again, all of this applies to our unaccompanied youth. So even if there's no parent or legal guardian available, immediate enrollment absolutely applies. So now we get to move into some more details, a little bit more detailed discussion about getting to graduation. What you see on the slide is just a sampling of some states whose data we were able to get because it's public regarding their graduation rates. All states and all school districts now are required to report disaggregated graduation rates for McKinney-Vento students. So we're going to be able to have this data from every school district and from every state to share. Just looking at this snapshot of states, you can see the lowest bar is the gray bar. Those are McKinney-Vento students. The highest bar is the blue bar, that's all, and then the orange, just in case this is a little small to see on your screen, the orange is all low-income students. So you can see in every state, the graduation rate for McKinney-Vento students is the lowest in the state. One thing I would mention though, if we were able to show you a graph of how these graduation rates look over time, you'd be able to see that in states like Washington and Virginia, that gray bar is getting higher every year. And in some school districts, that gray bar is actually higher than the blue. The McKinney-Vento graduation rates are higher than the graduation rates overall for the district. So we know that we can improve these statistics. We know some things that we can do to improve them, some strategies and some best practices. And so we're going to share some of those with you now so that you can really think about how you might be able to implement or adapt some of those for your own school districts. So a couple of things to start with, looking at McKinney-Vento. As amended by ESSA, McKinney-Vento now requires that at the state and local level, we have procedures to remove barriers to McKinney-Vento students getting partial credit. So especially at the high school level, but really at every level, as students move, they might be in one school for a month, then they might come into your school, let's say on October 1st, they've been going somewhere else for a few weeks. We want to make sure they get credit for what they've done over those few weeks. So we can take whatever credit they were able to earn in September from their previous school, we can add that to the credit that we're going to award them for October moving forward. If you're on a quarter or semester system or whatever kind of system you're on, you can put together those two pieces and you can get a full semester or a full quarter or whatever worth of credit. So we want to make sure that for every day that our students are able to get to school, they're able to get up from that garage or that floor or that car that they might be sleeping in, they're able to get to school, we need to make sure they're getting credit for every day that they're able to be in school and that we're putting those pieces together so that they can keep moving forward. Because what we find is if you enroll a student today and you say, okay, great, immediate enrollment, we've got them in school, everything's going well, but we're not going to be able to give them any credit for what they've done in September. It's very easy for students to fall behind very quickly. And then you can think about what if your boss said, well, you can come to work, we've got your desk, we've got your computer, we've got everything set up, but we're just not going to be able to pay you. It doesn't take very long for a person to become a little bit disillusioned with that model and say, well, why am I even bothering to come then if this is not really moving me forward towards a goal? So it really becomes a risk of dropping out if we're not giving students the credit for the work that they're doing. So this can be tricky. Different school districts calculate credits in different ways. You might be on a block schedule. Someone else might have seat time. So it can be a little bit tricky to calculate those partial credits, but we need to think about how we can do it and how we can award them so that they do accumulate. So absolutely, we have to do this in collaboration with prior schools. We've got to get their information from their school counselors, perhaps from their teachers, to know how can we calculate those credits and how can we award them. Something that might be worth 2 credits in one district might be worth a quarter credit in another. So we need to look at how we can do those conversions. The state of California and actually the state of Washington as well, they've actually come up with a statewide calculator. That's an online function and or they have it in paper where you can actually look at a formula and you can say, okay, if I calculate credits this way, then I'm going to put in my credit number, I'm going to multiply or divide or do whatever the calculator tells me to do. And that's actually going to immediately just pump out for me, okay, this is how many credits that's worth in the next district that student's going to or how that works. So certainly guidance from the state can be very helpful if we have a lot of differences between the way school districts are doing that. Another thing that some school districts do is they'll just do some testing for the student and they'll see how advanced is that student in math or in English or in whatever class it is. And so they'll give the student master-based partial credit, which means they might have been in the class for 2 months, but they might actually get 3 months worth of credit if they've already been able to master it. They might get a little bit less worth of credit if they were in the school for 2 months, but they had a big problem with absenteeism or they really weren't catching up to the material the way they needed to. And definitely offering credit recovery is really important to our youth. So even if we're doing partial credits and we're really doing everything we can to help them accumulate credits, sometimes they're going to fall behind anyway, just because of their attendance, because of what's going on in their lives. So if we can get them stable for a period of time, we want to maximize the progress they're making during that period. So if we have online classes or if we have other programs that we can use to help them accelerate their credit recovery and really help them kind of get ahead of the game or catch up over a period of time when they have some stability, we really want to take advantage of that. We wanted to provide you with some real life strategies that some school districts are using. So we're going to give you a couple just to kind of get you thinking and think about how you might be able to adapt these to your district. So one district we wanted to talk about is actually called Northeast Independent School District. They're in Texas, just outside of San Antonio. And what they've done is they've taken their early warning system that they use at the middle and high school level. This is something they have for all students. But they've really tried to make it very sensitive to McKinney-Vento students. And they didn't come up with this idea on their own. They did a lot of research. They were able to use some professional development money to go to a couple of conferences and hear how this was being done nationally, how this was being done in a couple of other school districts. So they took what they learned at these in-services and they came back home to San Antonio and they said, okay, this is what we've learned about dropout prevention, about early warning systems. How can we really make sure we're using this system to the greatest extent possible to serve our McKinney-Vento students? So they came back and they tinkered a little bit with their early warning system. And you can see here, this is actually a screenshot of their database. And they have this kind of flag system and this traffic light system, green, yellow, and red. And so depending on how many flags a student has in their little profile, they might get a yellow flag, they might get a red or a green light. Green light, of course, means everything seems to be going well, they're on track. Yellow means we have some problems, we have some risk factors. Let's put some interventions in place now before we get to the red light. Let's see if we can turn that yellow light green. And then sometimes, depending on what's going on, the student might get the red flag. And you can see that they're looking at things like, has their GPA dropped precipitously? So maybe whatever it was at the beginning of the year, whether they were a straight A student or a straight D student, have we noticed a big drop all of a sudden in their GPA? How did they do last year? If they had some course failure last year, let's put some things in place right away at the beginning of the school year. Let's not wait until they fail something at our school. Let's take that flag from the previous school and put some interventions in place right away. Attendance is a huge factor, and this is something that the liaison from Northeast and a lot of the liaisons have really emphasized to me. They are looking a lot at chronic absenteeism. They know their McKinney-Vento students have a hard time getting to school, so they're going to look at attendance, and that's going to be a yellow or a red light immediately if they see significant attendance issues. And for some of these systems, simply being identified as McKinney-Vento automatically is a flag. So that's going to automatically put you into a yellow light. And then if you add up some other issues, you might move to red. So they're using this to very quickly just take a look at where students are, what are some of the risk factors, and then they're going to get some interventions into place very quickly. So they're going to look at course recovery. Again, can we catch up on credits that you may have missed? They're also going to look at, well, what classes were you taking at your previous school? They're going to make an extra effort to get students into those same classes at the new school. So, okay, if you were able to get a geometry, partial credit, let's make sure you get into geometry at our school. We don't want to put you in Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 or something else. We want to put you in a course where you've already been moving forward so you can be getting those credits. They spend a lot of time with really monitoring those risk factors, monitoring progress. So your grades drop 10%. Do they drop another 10%? You have a lot of absenteeism. Are you missing school even more? And they're reevaluating their interventions constantly. If those red flags aren't going down, if they're staying the same or if they're increasing, okay, let's adapt our intervention. We've got to do something a little bit different. They will allow their academic deans to actually award credits. So they'll go ahead and look at what's going on in the student's credit list. And if they feel comfortable, we think we're close enough, we think we've got a credit, their academic dean will just go ahead and award a credit. And sorry, I just have to move the box here on my screen so I can see my PowerPoint a little bit better. They also will look at, like I said, everything they can possibly do for students coming in to make sure they don't lose credit for work that they've done in the past. Of course, some of this comes at a cost. Some of this comes at personnel time. Somebody is monitoring those records. Some of it's just automatic. The computer, the data program itself will filter through risk factors and put up a yellow light or put up a red light. So they don't actually need to have a person reading all this data for every student. But obviously the interventions take time. And that's something that school districts spend some money on, providing that mentoring time, providing the academic dean's time. So at Northeast, they actually did basically some calculations about what's the cost benefit analysis. How am I going to sell this to my administrators? So they looked at the ADA, which is the average daily attendance funding they were getting from the state for increasing the attendance, and they actually quantified that. And they said, okay, that's worth $35 a day. So if we can raise attendance, we're actually going to raise the money that we're getting back from the state. This is going to be worth money to us. If we can prevent one dropout, That's worth $5,600, and that's just the immediate cash benefit to the school district. That's not even calculating things like, we know the impact of high school graduation on the tax base for a community. We know its impact on things like justice involvement and other costs. So every student that we graduate, as opposed to having them drop out, is worth a lot of money, not only to the school, but to the entire community and to the entire state. So they actually quantified this. They brought it to their administration, and they said, if we can prevent 10 dropouts, that pays for a whole teacher. So the program actually more than pays for itself. And they really were able to sell it that way to the administration and get support for the program in that way. So I'm going to turn it over to Barbara to talk about a couple of other real-life school districts and what they're doing.
Thanks. And I want to say, too, that sometimes, we're going to talk about systemic responses, I guess, to homeless graduation and attendance. But sometimes it's basic needs that keep kids from attending school regularly, who are McKinney-Vento. I presented this weekend at the Real College Conference with a principal from a high school in Pennsylvania. They're putting a shower in the high school because that was something that was coming up again and again and again. And that's not something you can necessarily do right the next day, but he was like, there's the need, we're going to meet the need. Same thing with laundry. There was an article in a website called Chalkbeat about how basic needs interventions increase attendance. So things like a laundry machine, things like having a place for kids to get extra food. So we're giving you high level academic and other interventions, but I just want to say too, that sometimes it's figuring out the real basic needs like laundry and food that are very strong strategies to get used to graduation as well. So the next couple slides are from Rutherford County, Tennessee. We did a webinar with this school district liaison and her counterparts. They have over a 90% graduation rate for their students who are McKinney-Vento. They really rely on their Title I advocates. They put in every middle school and every high school so that they can be there looking out for students who are identified as McKinney-Vento. Obviously, they're collaborating with classroom teachers. They're looking at a variety of strategies, some of which Patricia already touched on, like online credit recovery, night school, and making sure that if transportation is a barrier to accessing any of those, that is provided as well. And while the early warning systems are extremely helpful, and I'll talk about one more, sometimes it can just be something as simple as this, an action plan. They call the Rutherford County, Tennessee calls their McKinney-Vento program Atlas. I'm sort of forgetting what it stands for right now, but it stands for something very positive. Excuse me. But you can see they're looking at kind of the student, the class, what they're doing, the school, the quarter. So they have kind of an action plan that is old school, if you will, not using the technology, but just helping them track. The last school district that we'll look at that has done some interesting things to really increase their graduation rate is Spokane, Washington. So here you can look at their statistics from 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, and the state graduation rate, the state low-income graduation rate, the state homeless graduation rate, and then SPS, which is Spokane Public Schools, their overall graduation rate, overall low-income graduation, and overall homeless. And you can see that their McKinney-Vento students are doing significantly better than the entire state's low-income graduation rate, and certainly significantly better than, thank you, Patricia. She's sort of highlighting the things that we're looking at there. And that was something, and you can also look, I think, very impressively, is over time, from 2013 to 2017, the big increases that they were able to see. And this was really based on some very intentional strategies that they were looking at to see, do these make a difference? So what they did is they said, okay, we've got some data. How do we really translate that into something programmatic that's going to make a difference? So it was at the district administration level that if this is a student group that is a marker for many other risks for dropping out, then we need to be intentional about how we're doing that. And they tried different things with their Title I set aside. They tried tutoring. They purchased academic products that they thought would be support learning. They looked at giving a small amount of funds to the highly impacted schools. but they really weren't seeing the sort of difference that they wanted from those use of funding and those programmatic interventions. So what they did, and again, this is going to be different in every school district, but just to sort of share their story, what they did is we really need to have a focused position for our McKinney-Vento program that is really looking at youth and families that specifically impacted schools. So rather than products, rather than tutoring, rather than sort of having the schools figure out what they're going to do, like really look at what a dedicated position can do, and specifically focusing at the 2 high schools that had a very high number of unaccompanied homeless youth. So that was one piece that they said they really sort of saw a difference. The other thing they did is okay, so we've got like the person power. What's going to be our tool? What's going to be the model of supporting the youth that this person works with? And for them, what they found to be effective was called Check and Connect. And I'm sure there are other interventions like this. There's a website there, which is basically a structured mentoring intervention. So how does this person look at how they interact with young people? Obviously, it's based on relationships, but this is the program that they found that actually made the difference, really moving those numbers and getting kids to graduation. So, it's about, you see the screenshot there of how they do it, but it's basically checking in on student progress, education-based variables. So you can see that if you compare this to what Northeast ISD in Texas did, there's some, and to what Rutherford County did, there's some things that are in common in terms of tracking kids, looking at what's happening. And in this case with Spokane, what they really added is that mentoring piece. One of the things that's really interesting that just came out, the Career and Technical Education Act was just reauthorized, and it has some very specific pieces in it about McKinney-Vento students. In Montana, the Montana State Coordinator actually ran her data for McKinney-Vento students who were enrolled in career and technical education compared to not, and found much higher graduation rates for students who are McKinney-Vento in the career and technical education. And of course, they don't know exactly why, but they sort of theorize that it's because they had access to mentoring, because the CTE programs came with an activities program and had mentoring. So for young people who are experiencing homelessness, so much going on in their lives, I say this is a housing issue, yes, but even more so it's a people issue. So that mentoring piece, whether it's through CTE program or something else that's existing, or an effort like this, can really be the key to helping young people get to the finish line. Okay, I think Patricia, this is you.
Yep, I'm gonna take over a little bit more information, kind of going back to some of the guidance and legal protections that we have in place. So a lot of times we used to get a lot of questions, and we still do, about full participation for McKinney-Vento students, and a lot of questions in particular about sports. And can they play varsity football if they haven't, if they came into the district in the middle of the year, or if they can't prove their residency in the district. And so there is some additional language in the McKinney-Vento Act since ESSA, saying that states must implement procedures to remove barriers to both academic and extracurricular activities. And the language that you see there is just the direct language from the law, so it might not apply to every district. You might not have magnet schools, you might not have all these programs. I know Nebraska doesn't have charter schools, but there is a requirement to make sure that students can access those specialized academic programs. Again, some of them might have deadlines. We want to make sure we're waiving those deadlines, et cetera. And it does apply to sports. So just to be clear, whatever your high school athletic league or whatever kind of program in the state of Nebraska sort of oversees your athletics at the middle school or high school level, they are required to comply with the McKinney-Vento Act. The McKinney-Vento Act does apply to them. There was actually a Supreme Court case finding that school athletic leagues were sufficiently associated with public schools that they do have to comply with education laws. So all of our McKinney-Vento students, even if they're coming in the middle of the year, or they can't meet the residency requirements that are typically required, they do have to be provided access to sports and other extracurricular activities. This does not overrule skill set requirements. So if I, as a 5'2" freshman, decide that I really want to be on the basketball team, I don't necessarily need to be on the basketball team if I don't have the requisite skills. But it just means that my homelessness and barriers that I might be facing because of my homelessness need to be addressed so that I can participate. And the Department of Education has some guidance on that you can see on the slide, really encouraging schools to look at their programs and to either prioritize McKinney-Vento students on wait lists if they get filled up, or to even hold spots. So if you're looking at things, for example, like career and technical education, where we know we have data showing that access to those programs increases McKinney-Vento students' graduation rates, then we want to take a look at making sure that those students can access those programs, even if they come in the middle of the school year. So that one is a good new piece of McKinney-Vento. There's also obviously increasing emphasis on trauma-informed practices in all areas of education. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this. You might be implementing trauma-informed discipline practices at your school or other practices. But homelessness in and of itself on its own is a traumatic experience. And then homeless students are also more likely to be exposed to other kinds of traumatic experiences like violence, like chronic illness, like malnutrition. And so really looking at our McKinney-Vento students through that lens, understanding that they're going to have needs that are related to their trauma, they're going to potentially act out in ways that are related to their trauma. I've been looking at disaggregated discipline statistics for McKinney-Vento students. Not everyone tracks those aren't required, but I've seen them in about 5 or 6 different states, and across the board suspension and expulsion rates are much higher for McKinney-Vento students than they are for other students. And so you ask yourself, when you send a McKinney-Vento student home on out-of-school suspension, where are you sending them to? They don't have a home. Where are they all day? You know, a lot of them have nowhere to be all day. They can't be in the shelter during the day. The person they're doubled up with doesn't give them a key to be home alone during the day when no one's there. So where are they going? What are they eating? School lunch might be the only meal they're getting. So obviously this is another dropout prevention strategy, is to really, we want to keep those kids in our school buildings as much as possible. Even if they need to be disciplined for something, that's fine. McKinney-Vento doesn't overrule your discipline policies, but maybe taking a look at how those could be adapted so that we're keeping our McKinney-Vento students in the school building, keeping them attached to school, and quite frankly, just keeping them safe. There's also a piece of McKinney-Vento now since the ESSA reauthorization that very clearly states that McKinney-Vento students must be able to access school counselors so that they can get information to prepare them and improve their readiness for college. And this really, I think, the importance of this, because you figure all students hopefully are able to access a school counselor, but the extra emphasis on McKinney-Vento students here, I think, is looking at the timing, trying to get them into that counselor early. 9th grade at the latest, 8th grade if you've got counselors at your middle school, because a lot of our McKinney-Vento students at a very young age, they're already assuming they're not going to go to college. That's not even on the table for them. They assume they're not going to get financial aid. They assume they're not going to get in. But if we can, again, get to them early and say, well, we can help you complete the FAFSA. We can help you select a school. We can help make sure that you accrue credits and that you graduate. And we can help make sure you go to college. I was actually just with a McKinney-Vento liaison last week. She's the liaison at her county office of education. She's been there for many years. And she was telling me about her own childhood and her own school counselor who said, well, we're going to try to get you into college. And she said, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to college. No one in my family has ever gone to college. This is a waste of my time. But she kind of liked the school counselor. They had a good relationship, and she just sort of went along with him just so that he wouldn't be disappointed in her. So she said, fine, whatever, I'll take the SAT. She did well on the SAT. And she said, well, fine, whatever, I'm not going to get financial aid, but fine, I'll complete the FAFSA. Just because this counselor was really prodding her to do it. And of course, years later, she did get her college degree. She's got a master's in teaching, and now she's the McKinney-Vento liaison for her district. So I think there are so many stories like that, where it's just one adult at the school, whoever that might be, who's saying, you can do it. You can do it. Let's try. What's the worst that could happen? You don't get in. Let's try anyway. So those stories are very common and really important for us to know that we can have a very big impact on a student just by being positive and being encouraging. Another piece of McKinney-Vento, this is kind of an overarching piece that applies both to states and to your local school districts, to look at your school policies and really examining those for barriers to identification, enrollment, and retention of McKinney-Vento students. And when you see those barriers, revising them. So you might have barriers to identification because, for example, the school secretaries aren't allowed to come to your training. I've seen districts like this where the administration sort of says, nah, the school secretaries don't need McKinney-Vento training. Well, that's a barrier to identification, because if your secretaries don't know about McKinney-Vento, they're not going to be able to identify students. They're probably going to turn them away. Those students may never return. There's a dropout now that we have. Whereas if we had a policy in the district that said, no, actually, this is just going to be part of the normal in-service that all our secretaries get when they come back to school in the fall, you've eliminated that barrier to identification. Same thing for enrollment, same thing for retention. It's very common for all of our school district employees to know the school district policies backwards and forwards, and you know the whole notebook and you can cite the whole thing, but people don't know federal education law unless we train them on it, or unless we just align our policies with the federal law. And then you don't end up with people confused because they're hearing one thing from over here, but their policy says another thing and they're not sure what to do. So just to facilitate that for our school district teams and align the policies with McKinney-Vento. And ESSA added language to ensure that when we're reviewing our policies, we're looking at outstanding fees or fines, and we're looking at absences. So again, when it comes down to graduation, if a student goes to enroll in a school and they say, well, we see that you've had, 12 absences already this year, we're not going to let you enroll. Just come back next semester and enroll next semester. We don't want to do that ever. Again, we want to keep students in our school, engaged with our school. So just because they have those absences, we want to make sure that those aren't a barrier to enrollment and to retention in school. And the same thing with fees and fines. We want to make sure that our students can get their diplomas, that they can walk at graduation, even if they have those fees or fines, and that they can participate fully. Again, we have some information from youth here, but because of the Zoom platform, I'd really encourage you to go to that link. And there's a video that's an entire video just of young people talking and sharing their experiences. But you can see on the slide when we asked youth a real general question of, well, what are just some really general tips you would give to school staff, whether those are liaisons, teachers, counselors, whoever, in terms of how they can really keep students engaged in school and really get them through to graduation. And you can see, on the screen the words that they said, the messages that they shared. One of the youth came out really clearly and said, because of what I've lived through in myself, my voice in my head is constantly telling me that I can't do it. I can't do things. Whatever it is, I can't do it. So I don't need anybody else telling me that. I'm already telling myself that every day. I need somebody telling me that I can do it and that I can try, and following through with me, and not assuming, that just because of my homelessness, I'm not going to graduate or I'm not going to get to college. So that, we get that message a lot. We wanted to spend just a little time also talking about Title I. A lot of the programs that we've mentioned from Spokane, from Northeast ISD, some of the ways that they're funding these programs are through their Title I funding. So it's really important to know that McKinney-Vento students are automatically eligible for Title I funds. It doesn't matter what school they go to. It doesn't matter how old they are. It doesn't matter if you use most of your Title I for a elementary school reading program. That's fantastic. But your high school level McKinney-Vento students still need to be served by Title I. So that in order to do that, we do have the Title I set aside. This is required from every LEA that receives Title I funds, whether they're all school-wide, targeted assistance, whatever the setup is. If you get Title I in your district, you need to be looking at how you can use those Title I funds to support McKinney-Vento students and setting aside some funding to do that. And so this is where a lot of funding, particularly for initiatives at the secondary school level, are funded. Some of this can come from your Title I funds. And this is a set aside off the top of the allocation, so it's before any other expenditures that you might be doing with your Title I funding. There's no formula for the set aside. Nebraska does require that every LEA set aside at least $100. I can tell you that in my work, I've seen school districts that set aside maybe $10,000, maybe $15,000. I've seen districts that set aside over $100,000 in Title I funds for their McKinney-Vento students. Again, this is going to vary a lot depending on how much Title I funding you have coming into your district. But it doesn't only depend on the number of McKinney-Vento students you've identified, because you may have low identification because your liaison really lacks the capacity to do a lot of the identification activities that Barbara talked about at the beginning. So you could use some of your Title I money to give your liaison more capacity to do better identification, and you might all of a sudden see your McKinney-Vento numbers go up. So it's kind of complicated in terms of the calculation. It's not just a formula. You want to look at the needs. How many students are you identifying? How does that relate to your poverty level? Do you think that maybe you're really under-identifying? And how are you serving the students that you have identified? And again, making sure that you're at least doing $100 in Nebraska. That would definitely be a minimum. As I said, funds can be used in a lot of different ways. The McKinney-Vento set-aside is a lot more flexible than what we normally think about when we normally think about how to use Title I funds. So again, you can use it for any McKinney-Vento student, no matter what school they're going to. You can use it for services that are not ordinarily provided with Title I funds. You can use it to give your McKinney-Vento liaison more time and more capacity, or maybe you use it to hire, a part-time data person just to help your liaison do some of the data issues so they can focus their time on things like training or other issues. You can use it to help provide transportation to the school of origin, but not only to the school of origin. You can use it to help provide transportation to other educationally related activities, educationally related support services, etc. So looking at all those different things that can help eliminate barriers and can help our youth accumulate credits, stay on track, and get graduated. Really what the Department of Ed says about this is, they really encourage schools to be creative, to use this in a way that's really going to impact the educational outcomes of McKinney-Vento students, whether that be providing basic needs, providing a backpack or food, or whether that be, tapping into an early warning system like we talked about earlier. And really their principles are, they just want to make sure that what you're using it for are services that are reasonable and necessary to allow your McKinney-Vento students to take advantage of educational opportunities. So for example, if you have a student who's really into soccer and they're playing on the county, travel team that's associated with the Boys and Girls Club, that's probably not going to be an appropriate use of Title I funds to provide transportation or uniforms for that. That's not even a school activity. We want to make sure it's a school activity and that it is connected to that youth taking advantage of educational opportunities. And the other piece is we want to make sure that those funds are used as a last resort. So again, that doesn't mean that if you have a student who can't see the board because they need glasses, you don't have to spend 2 weeks contacting every faith-based community, contacting every nonprofit in your county, trying to find somebody to provide glasses for the student. It means reasonably necessary. So if you know that the Lions Club will give you glasses if you just pick up the phone and give them a call, then pick up the phone and give the Lions Club a call. But you also can go ahead and use your Title I money for those glasses if you don't have another source that's reasonable and that's reasonably available, so that you can make sure that the student can see the work and can be able to advance that way. So those are really our secondary and elementary strategies for you. And now we're going to move into higher education, and Barbara's going to talk about some post-secondary strategies.
Great. So this is sort of the last big chunk of the presentation, and then after that, we'll take questions about any and all of it, or even things we didn't talk about. So if we're looking at the transition to post-secondary, there is now something specifically in ESSA for McKinney-Vento liaisons, a responsibility for liaisons to ensure that our unaccompanied homeless youth are informed that they do qualify as independent students for the FAFSA, and that they are assisted in getting verification of that status. We know that young people who have been what Patricia said about the liaison that she was meeting with in California, if they know that there is graduation beyond high school, there's a possibility of college, then it's a motivator to stay in school. So the sooner we inform unaccompanied youth that they can go to college and that will help them get the verification, the more likely they are to go to college, but also to graduate from high school. Under the McKinney-Vento and under the Higher Education Act, homeless unaccompanied youth do need verification from a liaison, a shelter provider, or a financial aid administrator. We'll talk about that in a couple more slides here. But also we have guidance that says that the local liaison can verify the status of the unaccompanied homeless youth in subsequent years after high school, as long as they have information, as long as they're still in touch with the young person and they know that they are still homeless and unaccompanied. And again, We'll talk a little bit about that later. Lastly, I just want to say that the link on the left-hand side, that resource there, and we have a sample letter, which I'll talk about in a second, but also we have, knowing that higher ed can be maybe a different world or a new world, we have a Pathways to Partnership document that just walks through the core higher ed partners that a McKinney-Vento liaison should be aware of and maybe help you find that partner locally. So why are we focusing so much on higher education? And this is, perhaps self-explanatory, but just to really emphasize that we know that the nature of our economy today, that the vast majority, over 95% of the jobs that are being created since 2010 have gone to college-educated workers, and that in just a few years, the majority of all jobs will require some education beyond high school. So it may not be necessarily a four-year degree, could be some sort of vocational or education or two-year degree or certification, but some kind of education beyond high school is increasingly necessary to be able to get a job that affords to pay housing. So when we look at those risk factors, those correlates for being homeless as a young adult and as an adult, we see education as the #1 risk factor, and it's related to income. It's related to all the things that education confers. So that's why we're really beefing up our work on higher education. So just some basics about the FAFSA, free application for student federal aid, is what students and families would complete for federal student aid. This may be a review for you, but just again, to let young people know and for you to know that it is free. There's a lot of organizations out there that will sort of charge to pay for completing the FAFSA. They don't need to do that, it's free. There's some websites that look kind of similar to the federal website, but they're not the federal website. So the official website is listed there. And again, for all students, the FAFSA has to be completed each award year in order to get aid. Today is the day. Today, October 1st, is the day that the 1920 FAFSA is out. The FAFSA, there was a change that was made several years ago, so that the new FAFSA, rather than being released in January, it was released a couple months earlier, October 1st. And this is really helpful for all students, but particularly for McKinney-Vento students for whom it may take a while to get everything gathered, to get everything in place. So we now have a new date today, October 1st, 2018, for the 2019-2020 FAFSA. And again, this is something that to be considered for the 1920 award year. Students will be completing this FAFSA between today and between June. I can't see on the date on the PowerPoint, but you can see it. Let me move the box there. Oops, let me move it. I can't move it. All right. So anyhow, that's the window for the 1920 FAFSA. We do also know that many states and colleges use the FAFSA for their own state institutional aid, and they may have earlier application deadlines. So the FAFSA is necessary to complete for all federal aid, excuse me, but also for state aid as well. And again, just as soon as possible, the better, because some of the awards are first come, first served. So we want to make sure our McKinney-Vento students aren't missing out on available aid. Next slide, please. So these are the category for independent students. So students are independent, which means they don't need to have parental income information or parental signature if they meet any of these categories. If they're married, if they're older than 24, veteran, graduate student, if they have a child, if they're legally emancipated, if they are orphan ward of the court, if they were in foster care at any time after age 13, and also unaccompanied homeless youth. When youth or people who are not youth apply for the FAFSA online, there's a skip logic. So they will see all of these categories before they see the question on homeless status. So we know that there are, for example, students who are homeless who may be veterans or who may have children or who may have been in foster care. They're going to see that information before they see the homeless question. But there are a lot of youth for whom they weren't any of those things, and it's the fact that they're an unaccompanied homeless youth that will make them independent for purposes of financial aid. So for unaccompanied homeless youth, homeless unaccompanied youth under age 24 are automatically independent students. Again, they don't need parental income information or signature. Also, youth who are unaccompanied at risk of homelessness and self-supporting are considered independent students. And this status needs to be determined in the year in which they are submitting the application. So at this point in time, it is something that has to be basically, they need to check that box and have that determination each year beyond the first year of college. Who can make those determinations? Under the Higher Education Act, there are 4 parties that have that authorization to make the determination of unaccompanied homeless youth status: the school district liaison, the director or designee of a runaway or homeless youth act shelter, or the director of a HUD-funded shelter or transitional program or designee, or a financial aid administrator. And we know, based on all the numbers that we see and all the calls that we get, that many youth aren't in shelters of any kind, whether they're funded by RHYA or from HUD, and they may not be identified in high school. So the financial aid administrator becomes a key partner and player in making these determinations for many youth who are homeless and unaccompanied. This is a tool that we have made to help facilitate the process. On our website, you can download this as a Word document. I sort of stretched it out to make it an image, but this is a Word document that can help you as a district liaison create something very simple, so you don't have to, the youth doesn't have to spill the details of their personal details, but rather you can take this form, you can edit it, you can put it on district letterhead, you can work with area colleges to make sure that they've seen it, they've shaped it with you, and you simply can say that you're the authorized party, give this basic information, check who you are, and this can be the determination that the youth has and that the youth provides to the school to make sure that they do get that independent student status. So we offer it to you. We have it on our website both for the previous award year and for this new award year, depending on the youth that you're working with. We also would really recommend that you share this tool with your providers in the community, as well as with your financial aid administrators, so that, again, there's something that's uniform, that's been agreed on, that's simple, and it makes it easier because we know that it's really hard for young people to share the details. And when we've got this requirement in federal law for liaisons to inform youth and provide the determination, here's a tool that you can use that you can customize to help fulfill that requirement. After high school, I touched on this before, but just specifically, the federal guidance to liaisons is actually the same guidance that they give to federal aid administrators. It's worded a little bit differently. But we had this issue, and it still comes up, where a youth in their second year, and the liaison makes the determination, they use the form, no problem, the youth is in higher education. Their sophomore year, it comes time to do the FAFSA, and they're being asked for the determination, and they're being sent back to the liaison. Well, actually, that really shouldn't happen. The financial aid administrator at that point should be making the determination, but sometimes the liaison does have a relationship with the young person, is in touch with them still, does know that they're still an unaccompanied youth or who's homeless or at risk of homelessness. So the federal government changed the rules, and they said, yes, as long as you've got the information to make the determination, you can do that through age 23. But if you don't have the information, you don't know, you haven't been in touch with them, you don't know that they're still unaccompanied and homeless or unaccompanied and at risk of homelessness and self-supporting, then the financial aid administrator has to make that determination. So that's been a change in the rules that can be helpful for youth that you may be in touch with, but also really make clear that the financial aid administrator has to make those determinations if you're no longer in touch with the young person. Again, we know that today's the day. So on our website, we created a 2 or 3 page document about 3 things that you can do to help now that the new FAFSA is out. This year, what we did is we targeted not just for liaisons, but also for homeless service providers and also for financial aid administrators and others working at the college. So our mission at Schoolhouse Connection really touches all of those, and there's something that people can do whether they're at the K-12 level, the higher ed level, or if they're working with services. So we've got lots of specific tips in this tip sheet. We've got lots of hyperlinks to various resources. So obviously we'll let young people know. We want to help them complete the FAFSA, and we want to remove documentation barriers. So those are the 3 things. So if you go on our website to the link there, you'll see some even more specific ideas and strategies and some links to some very concrete resources that you can use for those 3 specific things. Financial aid administrators, as I mentioned, do have some very specific rules as well. So what we have here on the next couple of slides comes from the federal guidance that goes to financial aid administrators. There's something called an application and verification guide, which is their version. It's their student aid handbook. And given the issues that have come up in the past, the Department of Education has issued some very specific guidance to them. For one thing, it's told them that they're actually not required to verify the answers to the homeless youth questions unless they have conflicting information. We know that many financial aid administrators still do require this verification, but they're not really required to. So the Department of Education says, for example, that just because a financial aid administrator disagrees with an authority, that's not conflicting information. So in other words, if you as the liaison make that determination, that financial aid administrator has to accept that determination that is an unaccompanied homeless youth. So if there's no conflicting information, the department's instructions are that you really shouldn't request any additional information in addition to that documentation. What we see, unfortunately, is that the culture within financial aid is one of being very averse to risk. Financial aid administrators are concerned about audits, so they tend to go a little more than what's actually required. And in doing that, they can set up some real barriers. So we hear a lot from our youth, a lot from service providers. In fact, I think if you go to our Q&A from our website and you put in FAFSA for searching that, you'll see tons of questions that come up about this. So there's a great need to educate and work in partnership with financial aid administrators, because they may be doing something that's very natural for them and the culture of their office, but that inadvertently and unintentionally stands in the way of youth who are homeless getting their financial aid. Certainly, we know that the youth in our scholarship program tell us about how traumatizing it is. It's re-traumatizing them every year if they have to be grilled about it. Last November, one of our young leaders testified before the Senate about the trauma she experienced and how she felt grilled and disbelieved and discouraged every time it came time for the FAFSA. So this doesn't need to be the case. And we also know that we have wonderful, very supportive, very compassionate financial aid administrators, but this is still a work in progress. So just a real plea to maybe invite them to McKinney-Vento development opportunities or develop relationships with them so they know who you are and understand this population of young people better. If a student is, and again, this is the guidance from the Department of Education, if they can't get that determination, they weren't in a shelter, they weren't determined to be homeless in high school, then the Department of Education says the financial aid administrator is required to make that determination. And they're required to make the determination based on the same legal definition of homelessness and unaccompanied that school district liaisons use. So they have to go through that same checklist and determinations without regard for why the student is homeless. So sometimes there's questions, maybe overly intrusive questions about why the student is in this situation as opposed to that they are in this situation. So the department instructs the financial aid administrators to just make the determination based on those legal definitions in the same way that a school district liaison would. They also tell them that if the student can't get any paperwork, if they were in their car, for example, that a documented phone call or a written statement from others is sufficient verification. There's not an official federal form. So the sample letter that I just showed you the screenshot of, that actually can be used by financial aid administrators as well. There's a checkbox for them. So if they, for example, want to have a piece of paper that they can put in the file so they can say that they did due diligence and they made that determination, they can use that form or another form. That there's nothing official from the Department of Education, but they can do an interview with the student and use that documented interview in lieu of paperwork from an authority if the young person can't get that from anywhere else. They can look to other parties, college access programs, TRIO and Gear Up, doctors, social workers, mental health professionals, certainly state coordinators or the National Center for Homeless Education. These are parties that are listed by the Department of Education for others who can be helpful in substantiating a youth status as homeless and unaccompanied for the FAFSA. Just a quick note, we get questions too, well, what about youth who are homeless but are not unaccompanied youth? In other words, youth who are homeless but with their families. In that instance, they're going to fill out the FAFSA the same way as any other student would, and their estimated family contribution, what the family contribution would be, is probably going to be zero based on what their parents are earning. So in this instance, they would be filling it out just like everybody else. We released on Thursday, again, I mentioned that this weekend was I would call it kind of the premier event around national convening around hunger and homelessness in higher education. So in advance of that, we released 5 tip sheets about supporting homeless youth in higher education. Our higher education program manager has been on a reconnaissance mission. She was hired in April, and has since then has been really digging deep and having conversations all across the country about what are those best practices and making sure that youth who are homeless get to and through higher education. So we have a new tip sheet series. I think the next slide spells out what they are. I can talk a little bit about them. So one of them are strategies for helping in that transition, the transition from high school to college. On the panel that we coordinated this weekend, there was this wonderful principal from a high school in Pennsylvania who talked about everything that they did in partnership. We've actually got that on our website as well, the specific strategies that he used, because he was able to track and say, okay, great, 80% of our kids from this high school are going on to college, but by tracking them, he found that only 11% overall were actually graduating. So what does that warm handoff look like between the high school and the college? We also had a bridge program from Indiana talk about what they did on the receiving end. So their program wasn't meeting McKinney-Vento students the first day they showed up at college. They were meeting them 6 months before they started college. Excuse me. So they knew who that program was. And because they didn't have parents, many of these youth not having parents, never having gone to college before, having people who they could go to, who they knew before they went to college, was absolutely huge in making that successful transition. So we know for all of these areas, whether it's the transition or how students who are homeless are identified once they're on campus, the housing supports on and off campus, the financial aid piece that we talked about earlier, or what do we do to sort of McKinney-Ventoize higher education, if we will, to create these programs that are like McKinney-Vento on the higher ed level. This is really an evolving work, an evolving practice. So the documents that we've created are going to be living documents. In fact, after this weekend, I told Jillian, I said, well, you're going to have to redo all of these because we learned so many incredible things that are happening across the country, both at the secondary and the post-secondary level. So take a look at those tip sheets. Please share them with your higher education programs, share them with your college access partners, and let us know about cool things that are happening so we can really keep abreast of all of this as this practice moves forward. We also want to let you know about our scholarship program, our Youth Leadership and Scholarship program that we have, which is a scholarship. In addition to that, we have a full-time case manager working directly with young people. We support them from the transition into higher ed and then the transition into the workforce, case management, and a lot of support along the way. The deadline is November 9th. So for this, we really want to be supporting students who are going to be entering college for the first time in the 1920 school year. So there's information on our website about that. I would love it if you could pass out to counselors to be on the lookout for this opportunity. We will make the determinations probably in December and then have the awards in April. But just to let you know about that, there's some frequently asked questions too that are on that particular web link there. So I think, let's see, yes, with that, just to wrap up with recap of a lot of the resources that we've mentioned along the way. I won't go over all of these, but there really is a lot of information online in future learning. And again, I'll just emphasize too that for us, we want to provide tools that are needed and practical. So if you look on our website, whether it's under early childhood or K-12 or higher education, you'll see that we've made an effort to do that, but if there's something missing, please let us know. Things that would be helpful, things that aren't being done, that need to be done. That's really sort of our sweet spot at Schoolhouse Connection. So lots of resources available, but we also are really interested in learning what more we can do to improve our assistance to school districts and education.